Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for attending the third lecture of the 34th Chanmu Lecture in History and Culture of New Asia College. To enhance academic and cultural exchange, the New Asia College of CUHK has been organizing the Chanmu Lecture in History and Culture since 1978. Every year, a distinguished scholar will be invited to deliver a series of public lectures exploring topics on Chinese history and culture. This year, we have great honor to have invited Professor Nicolas Standaert, Professor of Sinology, University of Leuven, Belgium. Today, between Europe and China in the 17th century. We are also very delighted to have Professor David Farr, Emeritus Professor, Department of History of CUHK, to be the moderator of this lecture. So without further delay, I will now pass over to Professor Farr to introduce the speaker and start the lecture today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, old friends and new friends, both here in this hall and online. I don't know how many people online, I believe quite a lot. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Standaert. And this is his third lecture in the Tianmu series. And if you know about the Tianmu series and Professor Tianmu, you know that Professor Tian all his life wanted to advocate the importance of Chinese culture in the world. And we all accept that. We all believe Chinese culture is very important. But if you're standing away from China, from Chinese culture, you sometimes get the idea that maybe there is a China and there is an outside world. How would the Chinese be able to understand the outside world? How would the outside world penetrate China? And probably in Hong Kong, we know that more than anybody else. We live in that environment. We see it all the time. We breathe that air. And Professor Standaert, in the last two lectures, told us how. And he said, don't look for that divide between China and the outside world. It is not a war of steel. It is a sieve. Many things get through from one direction. Many things go through from the other direction. He says, look for the in-betweenness, what goes in between the two cultures. That is the crack that will allow China to integrate into the rest of the world. And today, in the sort of political environment we live in, the confrontation between East and West, this is more important than ever. Because if we can't break through that barrier between cultures, the consequences are so bad as to be unthinkable. So allow me, Professor Standaert.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction, and you summarize very well one of the actual purposes of this type of research. And once again, thanks to you and also to the head of the New Asia College, I'm not only very honored, but also very happy to be here and to share with you these common interests. The title of my talk is indeed the In-Betweenness, this crack, and also the word displacement or dislocation. And by this, I mean that if we want to find cracks and in-betweenness, then we also have to be dislocated. What I will do in this talk, I will show how objects are displaced, move from one place to another, but also, and that is as important as the objects, that we also are mentally displaced or dislocated. So that this requires that we, in our mind, we are also displaced or dislocated. That is very briefly the purpose of my talk. And I will focus on mainly prints and other objects, how they circulated from Europe to China and from China to Europe. And then we will see how this also can change our mind. That's the purpose. I start with this picture, which I already showed in the previous talk, which is the world map of Matteo Ricci, and not only of Matteo Ricci, of a common work of Matteo Ricci with Chinese scholars. And what is typical of this map is that there are all kinds of prefaces within the map, in the spaces in between the continents. And these scholars are discussing the past, the present, the different consequences, and also they are exposing what is the use of a map. A map today still orients where we want to go, but a map can also show the administrative organization of a country. And one of the scholars says, yeah, but with a map, you can have ease. So what I want to invite you to is that you recline at your ease and that we will engage in a travel through different prints. What shall I do? I will first expose the sources that I will discuss. Then we will see how these sources traveled from one place to another. Then we will observe how images not only are changed by a context, but also create new context. And then we will have the theme of perspectives, the types of perspectives that exist. And finally, that will be the final point, the mental displacements that, or dislocations that are created by images themselves. So let us start with the sources for those who are not acquainted with them. And I focus on prints of the late Ming Dynasty. And so more or less until 1644, sometimes going a bit beyond it. Basically, there are 4 series of prints, of which this is one of the first ones, and they were published in Zhengshe Moyuan. That is, in fact, a kind of marketing book for selling inked stones. So there was Mr. Cheng, and he wanted to make publicity for his inkstones, and he published this kind of images, all kinds of images, and he integrated also Western images in his book. So that's very interesting to see already that these religious images are integrated in a commercial, you could say, book at the time. So this is the calling, Jesus who is calling Peter, and this comes from a Western image, and a lot of these images were published in the Netherlands or in the Flanders, and it's in fact the area where I come from, but that was in the 17th century. So you have another image by a certain relics. What is interesting here is that the original print that you have here, this is the print, first went to Japan, and there was probably transformed, and then came to China, And you have already a displacement, not only from Europe directly to China, but via Japan to China. A second series was published around 1619, and that is in a book about the rosary. The rosary is a book or help to pray, a prayer in the Catholic tradition, where people pray a number of times the Our Father and the Hail Mary. And meanwhile, they meditate what they are praying about. What is interesting here is that these prints are those that are most adapted to a Chinese context. And they come from a book by a certain Hieronymus Nadal, Evangelicae Historia Imagines, and that book was published in the late 16th century. It traveled to China. We know exactly that there were 1 or 2 copies in China, and they were the basis of these images. Originally, there were images separate, but also in a meditation book. I come back on that a bit later. As you can notice in these prints, there was an important transformation because the objects, for instance, are not or no longer Western tables or clouds. These are typically Chinese objects. Moreover, there is a whole perspective, which is typical for Chinese painting, for Chinese prints, that you have an opening, and they open at the end, and the importance of empty space in Chinese paintings. Whereas you can clearly see the Western as a wall closing the scene. Finally, there is a kind of transformation from the angel into probably a dove of a bird representing the Holy Spirit. And there, that is a kind of signature of the interaction between a Chinese engraver and probably a missionary explaining, oh, you can replace it by an angel. Otherwise, nobody will understand what is this angel or this human being coming down from above. We come to a third series. A third series was published in 1637. 天主降生初上金节. And this is also based on the same work by Nadal. The difference is that here, the resemblance is close to the original view. As you can notice, there are many, many more similarities between both. I will come back on these drawings later. You have another case here, and we will analyze this print a bit later. And then finally, there is a fourth series. And the fourth series, this is in a booklet of images presented to the Chinese emperor by Adam Chalfont-Bell. And typically of this book, there are about 48 images. Part of them come from the same book by Nadal, but also of quite a number of other engravers. I spent my time in going through all kind of books on engraving in order to identify the originals. And you can see this is still Nadal. And this is Bartholomeus Ricci. That is not Matteo Ricci, but another one. And this is Goltzius. Goltzius is a Dutch engraver, all from the first part of the 17th century. You see changes, and we come back on these changes later. And then this is Jacobus de Geen. And this is Raphael Zadeler. You see, there is a kind of simplification, but we will have to figure out where the simplification comes from. And it is again Raphael Zadeler after Rottenhammer. And this is Kager. And again Kager. I come to a first conclusion. When you look at this image, you will notice that there are a number of differences and resemblances, but I want to focus on the people here. When you see these people and these persons, they are the same. That are the so-called apostles. But now we are going, we fix on the other people there. And they are different. These are Chinese. And you see official and common people, a wide variety of people represented in this image. And this is representative of this circulation of prints, because these prints were produced in China and they circulated among Christian communities. And this Christian community is represented in the print, as is the case here. So the community that receives this print is also present in the print. So the converted image can become a power of conversion. Because images become Chinese, Chinese can also become Christians. It's not the only, that's more or less the displacement that takes place already within this picture. So this was just the presentation of the images that we are going to follow. Let us now see how they move from one side of the world to the other side of the world. And I tell you the story of the fourth series of prints, the life of Christ presented to the Chinese emperor. And the story starts in the Low Countries and also in Augsburg, in Germany, and in München. This is Nicolas Trigault, and he was a missionary who came to China, and he was here only for 2 or 3 years. He arrived just after the death of Matteo Ricci. And then he was sent back to Europe to recruit new missionaries and also to gather some books. Now you see this beautiful drawing, and this drawing was made by the very famous Rubens. So Trigault went to Antwerp, and there Rubens drew this image. It is now in the museum in New York. We have other traces of Trigault's visit to Belgium. For instance, when he came to Belgium, he made some drawings, some Chinese characters, and this is still kept in the National Library in Brussels, the Royal Library in Brussels. Moreover, there is a text, a pamphlet of only 8 pages, and this is published in Dutch. In fact, Trigault was the person who brought this book back from China. That is the diary, that is the journal of Matteo Ricci. Matteo Ricci wrote that in Italian, and on his way back, Trigault translated that into Latin. But before it was published in Latin, there was already a text, a summary of it in Dutch. And that is still kept in the Netherlands. Now, this book was published, as you can see, in Augsburg, Augusta. That is a city very close to München in Germany. And it was engraved by a rather important engraver at that time. As you can see, on the map or on the cover of the book, you also have a map of China. And as happened very often at that time, the maps were turned around so that they could have a larger view on it. There is a very nice collection of these kind of maps, including this book in the University of Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Now, Trigault came back from China. He went to Rome, and then he went to München and Augsburg. And there he met with the Duke of Bavaria, Maximilian I. And the Duke of Bavaria said, I want to give a present to the Chinese emperor. And we have the whole description of the present that he wanted to make. The monos is the context of it, the content of it, in very detailed description of what he offered or wanted to offer to the Chinese emperor. What he offered was what we call a cabinet, a Wunderkammer. That is a wooden construction that is very nicely designed with many objects in it, and that was transported to Macau. And then we have no news about it. So I even asked in Macau, is it still somewhere there? But nobody could help me. So this is not the original. This is another cabinet that was made around the same time as the cabinet that was sent to China. And there is a whole description of this Wunderkammer that is very similar to the Wunderkammer that was sent to China. Now, why can we somehow know that this is the similar type? Because at that time, when one constructed these Wunderkammers, these cabinets, they often made two at the same time. Because you take, for instance, very precious wood and you carve an elephant, and then what you did not carve is lost. But let's say that this is black. So you can have on one hand a black elephant and on the other, in the other object, a black background. And then you take a white object and you make a white elephant. And on one hand, you have a white elephant, and you have, where do you have the black elephant, you have a white background. So that's the way how they worked. So this gives an idea of what the Wunderkammer that was sent to China. This Wunderkammer was a book published in the 1920s, but the Wunderkammer itself was destroyed at the end of the Second World War, except for some objects. So you can see how it looks like. And this kind of Wunderkammers, so you have paintings in it and you have all kinds of drawers in which you put objects. And this way, these Wunderkammers were objects of a display of knowledge, of wealth. And so these were very important gifts that were made at the time. And as you can see, one even made a painting of this Wunderkammer. In it, you have all kinds of objects, and that's important for us because in the document with a detailed description of the content of the gift of Maximilian I to the Chinese emperor, they would say, in the first drawer, you have scientific instruments. In the next drawer, you have a small book and you have some other objects. This is one of the objects that is included in the Wunderkammer that went to Pommern, the other place. And when we look at it, this is a scarf. And when you have a close look, what do you see? You see the characters Fu and the character Shou, Chinese characters on this scarf. So my guess, I cannot prove it, is that Rigaud had this scarf with him. He came to München and he gave this scarf that was put in the Wunderkammer that went to Pommern, to the other place. You can see how there is this circulation of objects because this Wunderkammer is dated exactly 1617 when Rigaud was in that place. We continue with our description of the objects that were sent to the Chinese emperor. And here it is said that in the Wunderkammer, there is a small book as big as a hand palm with paintings and decorated with gold letters. That's the description, all in Latin. And this is the book on the basis of which the Chinese version was made at a moment when, a few years later, Adam Charles von Bell presented that book to the Chinese emperor. We know exactly the contents of this book. For instance, there are the reference to Nadal. Nadal is the author that I already mentioned with this prince. This booklet, I still hope that one day we can find it in the National Palace in Beijing or in other place. But since we have this description, I went all the way to München because there in one museum, they said we have a small book. This book here is not bigger than the palm of your hand. So small, you could not believe. And I went there 8 o'clock in the morning because the museum was still closed. And then I could enter the place and under the guards, and we opened the book. And what did we see in this book? This was parchment written with golden letters, exactly the same as the description of the book that was given to the Chinese emperor. And that was effectively given to the Chinese emperor because we have the reaction of Adam Charles von Bell relating the reaction of the Chinese emperor. Now, displacement and changing one place to the other. I start here with a painting by Rubens that is in Mechelen. Mechelen is about 25 kilometers from the place where I live in Leuven, and also near, it's between Brussels and Antwerp. So it's a very small place. There is this painting, and there was a print made of this painting. That's the print. You can see how similar it is. And this print is dedicated to the Maximilian I in München. And you can see that in this small booklet that is still preserved in München, it's taken from the same place. Now, what is important here is that you can see that here it is simplified. This is much more complex. This is simplified. And why is it simplified? Because it's so small. It's a very small painting. And this is a key for us to understand the prints that were produced in China. You see how beautiful this is? It is as if these are living persons, at least when we can believe what Adam Schall said of the Chinese emperor when he saw them, his amazement. So, Trigault went to China, came back to Europe. He went to Augsburg, to the Low Countries, and he took back this Wunderkammer, together with in it the small book. And then he went to Macau. He arrived there in 1620. And then we don't hear anything anymore about the Wunderkammer and also not about the book, except for about 20 years later, when Adam Schall presented that to the Chongzhen emperor. And it is at that moment that he had a print made and a translation made of the Latin text, and that was printed in China. And this is the print, and you also images like that. Actually, there was still a longer story, because this image later, about 25 years later, was used again by Yang Guangxian in a criticism of Christianity. The Buddha Yi was used later. So we see this whole story, Trigault coming to China, going back. Then we had paintings and prints that were converted into, again, painting on parchment that traveled to China, became new prints, and these prints were again printed in other texts. So this is one story, and I will give you several of these stories. Now we tell a story that starts from China, and that also goes to Europe, because the first story that I told was from Europe to China, basically. There was a missionary living in the Philippines, and he traveled, his name is de las Cortes, and he traveled to Macau. But they had a shipwreck, and he arrived in Chaozhou. And there he was caught by the police, and then he spent about 11 months in China before going to Macau. And the diary that he kept, not only diary, he had a kind of notebook with all kind of information about China. And in it, you see that's Relation del Viaje, relation of the story of what happened, and that is kept in the British Library. You have this kind of images. The hats of officials. So, in fact, these are represented in a number of leishu. For instance, the Cancai Tuhui. It's not exactly the same, but probably this type of books that he used. You also have this kind, in this leishu, you have this kind of wuqi, of weapons. And we are going to follow the story of these two weapons, these swords. And these are swords that are used in very often also in rituals, in official rituals. Here we have a further part of his manuscript, and as you can see, we find this kind of swords. So let us follow Descartes. One way or another, this manuscript travels to Europe. We don't know exactly when, but anyway, it must have arrived probably in Portugal. And then we will see that it appears in a book published in 1670. So about nearly 50 years later. And then about 30 years later, it will appear on another cabinet. That's the story that we will follow. So here we have the hats, and they appear in a book by Alfred Dapper. Alfred Dapper wrote a book on the delegations, on the embassies of the Dutch to the Chinese court. So they were received as a tribute relation, and when they came back, they published a whole book on their experiences in China, and they gave several descriptions of what is China, including this kind of information about the hats of officials. And one way or another, I don't know how, he had access to the manuscript of the Las Cortes to reproduce these images or these hats. Here we see in the same book our two swords. Here we have a kind of small drum, and we see the manuscript version with a nice character key of gold. And here we have the printed version. And as you can see, there is a small mistake in the character. And these details are, of course, extremely important for us. We'll notice why. Now, a few years ago, it happened at my own university. They have this cabinet that was made by William III of Orange, the King of England, around 1700. And this was damaged during the Second World War, but now they had some money and they want to restore it. And they said, there are here maybe some elephants or so. Is there something Chinese in it? They came to me and said, can you give some advice? Well, I'm not a specialist in this kind of matters, but I was looking at this image and I said, well, I cannot say anything about the elephants, but when I see this, there are some curious things. First, and this is not my invention, so we will focus on this here. They had already noticed that this came from some of these books, books describing Roman military accessories. And as you can clearly see, this came indeed from this kind of book. But then, what did I notice? Here we have it. A wrong character. It can only come from there. Our original. And what do you think about this? And what do you think about this? And there is this also in the same cabinet. This is again Roman. But then we have the hats. And we have the hands. Do you see what happens? This is displacement. This is going from one place to another. And how this is integrated in one new construction. And it's partly by chance, because I would never go and look at this cabinet. It's by chance that they come and ask me. It's by chance that I like this kind of images and I start to look at it, and that, we can make this kind of connection. Also, you can notice that it's not only printing and painting and not only parchment, but also wooden constructions or cabinets. And you can see that you have several other examples, like this kind of flags. It's not exactly the same, but this comes probably from similar kind of books. I could not identify them. And we have this kind of paintings by Tian Pigeon on the cultivation of silk, which is a quite famous book. And you find that back in all kind of porcelain, but also in paintings. They are reproduced on all kind of different material objects. This is also a nice one. Mo was speaking about the screens. I was in a bookshop in Brussels, and there was a book about museums in Portugal. And I opened that book, and I see this screen. And I said, but I recognize something. Let us have a look at this. So this was the painting, the drawing, the print that we already saw. It became a Chinese version. And here we have the same. The similar one is also here. That is also one of these prints. And these are the screens. They are called the Coromandel streams. They were mainly made in Fujian for export. But objects travel from Europe to China, and there they are reproduced and they are traveling back to Europe. So it's really they change from object to object and from one continent to the other and back and forth. So it's a fascinating world in which we move. Now I come to the third topic, and the third topic is images creating new context. We have already noticed a number of changes that appear in the fact when you reproduce a painting or an image and so on. I like this print. That is a print that has nothing to do with China, but this is also 1601. And this is Jan David, and he says, look how these painters, you have all kinds of painters here, they are painting Jesus wearing the cross. And in fact, there is only one who reproduces the right Jesus. The others make him a devil, or they paint the Last Supper or the bird, and so on and so on. And that's more or less what happens when we read text or when we look at images. We start to imagine our own imagination of prints. So we can notice all kinds of changes that happen. This is discovered by one of my colleagues. This is the mathematical thesis of a student. When a student obtained his PhD in the 17th century, they had their theses printed, and on top of it, they made a drawing and also reproducing an image of their supervisor. These are beautiful times, of course, in the past when we did things like that. Now, on it, you have what they call the muses. These are representing the sciences, the different sciences. They were represented by ladies. and the queen of the sciences at that time was theology. But you had the lady for astronomia, the lady for musica, the lady for algebra, and so on and so on. So this was carried by Verbist, probably, or sent to Verbist. Verbist was a Belgian missionary in China. And we have them in the so-called Tongqi Chang. It's not Tongqi Chang, that's for sure, but it's often called the Tongqi Chang album. Why do we know that it's not Tongqi Chang? Because Tongqi Chang was already dead 30 or 40 years before the text came there. And here you can see also how they are reproduced, and they change their place in the whole. They are kept in New York in the Museum of Natural Art, I think. Other changes, and so you can see how they are adapted with a Sino-European background, and the whole construction here also is different, but they are really beautiful in the way in which they are representing. You have books on all kind of technical instruments. This is, do you know what this is? This is a computer before computer existed. How to read books, several books at the same time, without them falling down. If you don't believe this kind of, wait, I will come back here. They still exist. And you see, they move in such a way that they don't fall, they always stay in the same thing. So these kind of books or this kind of instruments were introduced to China. And then it's interesting, at least I like them, to compare them and see what happens in kind of cultural translation, visual translation. On one hand, you can see, wait, I must say, no, excuse me, yeah. So, okay, this, yeah. The books here are clearly Chinese. And the covers of the book there. And then, yeah, here there is a problem because, yeah, if you're really technical, probably this will not work. Now, of course, we should not laugh with that because the point is then, of course, when we laugh, I always say to my students, we can laugh, but then we have to think why we laugh, because when we laugh, we see the difference. And then we have to understand, yeah, that, and one of the theses is that these images present a global view, a total represented behind it. So here this I already showed, and this is the same. You can see that this is called a drum treadmill, where it's what is outside is inside, and the other way around in the two pictures. You see that this here, yeah, that would not work basically. So. But again, the representation of a global view. Let us look at anatomy. That's especially for you. So this, I had these images, and then I was, what I like is just to try to find the original ones. With all these images I'm searching, and that can take some years before I can find them. So when I had this, so what is important here is this object. and you can search for Vesalius, but you don't have that object, and you search for some other ones, and you don't have that object. So I search until I find exactly the same. So I went through all mathematical books that we had at the university. I couldn't find them, and I regularly went to the Library of Theology where they have the ancient books. And then one day I arrived there, and then the librarian says, "Oh, are you still interested in anatomy?" I say, "Yes, I'm still interested in it." He said, "Oh, we just received a new book. Do you want to have a look at it?" I said, "Yes, of course. I want to see all the books until I find it." And I opened the book. Yes, and there it was. So this was, you have Andreas Vesalius, who is, of course, the most important one, but this is Paré, and he is a bit later, and he used partly the information also of Vesalius. And then, of course, you see already all kinds of differences. Here, there are all kinds of numbers, whereas here you have the Jia, Yiping, and so on, of the Chinese one, but you can see that this is important. But there is no spade, because in the Chinese context, that has no sense. The spade, what is the significance of the spade in the European context, is the grave digger. So that this is a dead person. You have this kind of images. Sometimes some people say, anatomy, but it's a total view that is represented. And here the same, you have the skit that has disappeared, and because that's the same significance, namely that someone has died. And when you hear, they count exactly all the ribs that we have, and here again this global view where the details have disappeared. When we look at this here, that is the original one. And here you see everything is white. So here, this is clair obscur. And here that has disappeared. Moreover, we have to notice the hat. So according to some analysis, this would be Radaming, and this may be Qing, just on the basis of what is the hair. And the genital organs have been replaced by the characters. Now, what is important here? There was a book by Shigehasu comparing the Greek and the Chinese medicine or medical tradition. And he explains well that in Chinese tradition, what is important is the skin and the color of the skin at that time. And that in the European tradition, what is important are the muscles. And what is interesting here is that exactly this kind of shift appeared. When we look at representations, medical representations, you see that's all around the same time. In Chinese books, you have this kind of representations. That does not mean that Chinese cannot paint chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro, that means that you represented the forms, the volume on the face or on the body by painting or drawing some parts more dark and some parts more light, so that you can see that here the flow. The volume is represented by what is made dark here. And here, the volume here is represented here. And here you can see that he used the chiaroscuro method, and that is Xiaopingzhen. But basically, so muscularity versus the color of the skin, this kind of shift translation that was made with these prints. Now, most interesting, when we did research on it, there was an article by Idema on skeletons in Chinese tradition, and he mentioned that Luo Ping, that is 1772, so that's more than 150 years later, has a painting of the descents in the pleasures of the ghosts. That is a Buddhist painting. And let us see what we have here. So the same anatomical drawings, they appear in Buddhist paintings 150 years later. And you also have the simplified version, and that is this here. So it's really fascinating. And then you can say, yeah, but what's the relationship and religion? We should not forget that also for Europe, in the 17th century, anatomy that belonged to a domain that was also religious. Vesalius, Paré, they will write, the human being has two eyes in order to discover God in all things. And then they describe the technical part. And here it is used in a Buddhist context. Other changes that may appear, that is the feminization. This is a masculine representation. And then here it is already in China, feminization, and it becomes also feminine. And you see here is a quite precise reproduction. Now we are looking at the other side of the story. I just gave a few examples of European prints that went to China and that underwent changes, but it's the other way around as well, or in certain cases where it is very detailed the same. This is quite remarkable. This is one of the visits also by the Dutch, Johan Nieuwhof, who went to China. And you can see here, these are the original drawings, but when they were printed, they added all the trees to make it exotic. And the boats, and so on and so on. Transformation of the scenery. I'm not going into all the varieties of changes that would lead me too much. My purpose is, of course, to show you a general idea also of the varieties. And by the way, so these are not always things that I have discovered. And these books, for instance, were published and discovered by Dutch researchers and published also and showing the differences. You see that here also what it became. Another reproduction, this is again the Las Cortes, in which you have drawings of all kinds of punishments that were executed in China. And you can see that you find the same drawing, but you also have a public added to it. And you have the same here with a public added to the drawing. And I was wondering why this could be, and there was a very interesting article by a French colleague who said, or who wrote, he worked on photographs of the early 20th century with public punishments. And he said that in China, punishment, the purpose of these public punishments was to show how the punishment fitted the crime as stipulated by the code. Whereas in Europe, it would more show a spectacle, a show that would have a redemptive effect on criminal and the attendants. And so what I found interesting in his explanation that indeed in these European prints, you have a public added because it could have a redemptive effect also on the attendance or the public. So this was an overview of all kinds of displacements, of changes that took place when images come from China, come from Europe and go to China, or from China to Europe. Now we are focusing on perspectives. And this is an image that I showed in my previous talk also, but I will repeat it here. When we talk about perspectives, is where do we stand or where do we position ourselves? When we look at these maps, this is the original map that Ritchie carried to China. Europe is in the center and China is in the periphery. And when he and his colleagues produced that in China, then Europe became in the periphery and China in the center. Now, you see the same here, and you see the same here. But in this case, as you can see, Europe is in the center and China is in the periphery. But there is a problem with this map, although it is in the Kobe City Museum, because you can see that these are scrolls and there is a text on top, and this text does not fit. And this shows that even today, and I saw the same map in Paris, that we are so much influenced by a certain perspective, namely that Europe is in the center and that China or the East is on the periphery, that even Japanese, when they have to hang this map, that they hang it in that way. Fortunately, we have PowerPoint, and here is the map in the correct way. Now, I want to show the moving perspectives. So, and it's important to distinguish with two ways how to express perspective. So you have the so-called geometric perspective and the so-called isometric perspective. And these are two ways to show depth or express depth in a painting or in a drawing. So you have the examples here, where you can clearly see on the right hand is geometric, on the left hand is isometric. Now, generally speaking, the geometric perspective is typical of the Renaissance in Europe. And isometric is typical of Chinese drawing and painting. So we see, for instance, one of the books published at that time by on the Confucius-Sinarum philosophers. And what did the publisher do in Paris? Well, he used a very nice geometric perspective. Let us look at prints. Here we see how it uses the typical isometric perspective. These are Chinese prints. Let us look at this here. Here we see a geometric perspective, and we see here an isometric perspective, the changes that were operated. As I mentioned, in Europe, geometric perspective was very much developed at the time and linked also with geometry and with mathematics. And you had one of the famous specialists of perspective, Pozzo, an Italian, and these books, beautiful books, were also translated into Chinese. Beautiful prints that you can find also in Beijing. So. Now, what is interesting is that, as Professor Faure also mentioned, we have to avoid to say, oh, and this is Chinese and this is European. What I'm interested in is, how does this come together? For instance, let us look at this one here. And here, they nicely reproduce the same geometric perspective, but very interesting. Look at this. Here are no tiles, and here they added the tiles, and they are in isometric perspective. You can see that in the same print, you can have two different perspectives. Chinese were perfectly capable of reproducing the geometric perspective. This is Jiao Pingzhen, who was a Christian, famous painter. And we have here is, because he was also at the Astronomical Bureau, he had these paintings, and you can see how well he mastered this technique. And this is also by him, and you can see the same. Now, some of these images, not of Jiao Pingzhen, I have not yet identified the origin of this, went also to Europe, where they produced European prints of the life of Confucius. This is the famous scene that we just noticed before. And you can see that here, the European print reproduces the isometric perspective. In the same book, you will have geometric perspective and isometric perspective, the combination again of both. Let us look at this print. This is published in China with a perfect isometric, geometric perspective. But this is very interesting because here you have two perspectives. On one hand, you have geometric, but here you have a bird's view perspective. What I mean by that is that if you are standing here, you cannot see the back normally of this platform. You cannot see that from here. So let us see what happened here. Here you have a top view, a bird's view. So that shows how in one and the same print, you can have different perspectives, which of course for me is interesting because of in-betweenness and the combinations that happen to be there. And this is a beautiful Castiglione also with the same technique. I come to the final part, and these are the perspectives that dislocate. Namely, how can perspectives make that we move and that we also mentally move? And here I come back on my first and my second series of documents that we looked at. And I mentioned that they come from the book by Nadal on the history of the Gospels, the life of Christ, basically. And this book does not only have images, but also guidelines and help for meditation. How to meditate with visual prints of the story of the Bible. Now, what is very important to understand these visual meditations is that in the tradition of Nadal and of Ignatius, who was the founder of the Jesuits, Ignatius wrote a book on the spiritual exercises. Basically, he says, when you want to have a healthy body, you have to exercise yourself and you have to walk and to do sports. But when you want to be mentally healthy, you also have to exercise your mind. And you can meditate by exercising your mind. And how do you do that? When you meditate, you start with what he says, the composition of a place. And what does he mean by that? Is that when you meditate a story of the Bible, for instance, Jesus was walking through a village and there was a tree and there was a man who had climbed into the tree to meet Jesus. Maybe you have heard about that story. When I'm telling that story, you can start to imagine and compose a place mentally where you see a street and you see a village and you see the tree and you see this man in the tree. That's a composition of the place. So when we meditate, when we remember something, what is fundamentally important is a place. If I ask you, where were you on 9/11, 2002? These are for 2002 or 2001, 2001. For the people who are a little bit older in the room, they will know exactly where they were. You remember the place. That's the first thing. If I ask you what happened 5 days ago, the first thing you have to remember is in which place were you? And then you can start to think about it. So the place is very important. And then, of course, the notion of displacement becomes significant because you can be moved, you can be displaced once you have established a place. So this sounds a bit a longer explanation, but you will start to understand what I mean by it. Now, so this is a method that is used by Ignatius and by Nadal, and he is writing all kinds of meditations on the Gospels. And then they were wondering whether they would add these images or not to this book of meditation. Now, there is a problem when I use images, because that could fix my idea. That could have as a result that I take this as an historical event, or that every time I meditate, that I'm only fixed by the image that is given to us, and that there is no dislocation or displacement in the image. So what happened is, when I mention this, when I present this image, and I would ask you what strikes you, then I think most of the people would say, my focus goes to the central scene, and then I do not know exactly what happens beyond, but then you start to look at the details around it. Now, what did they do? What did they invent it? Namely, here you have A, B, C, D, and so on. And in the image, you have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and so on. So in order to help you to displace yourself from the central view, they will say, now you go to A, and then you go to B, and then you go to C. So let us look at it here. So first, you meditate. God brings together all the angels to say, what if I become a human person? And we have to find an angel who will announce that to Mary. And then B is the angel becomes a real angel, the spirit becomes a real spirit, and then goes to the house of Mary. But instead of moving directly to Mary and the angel, first goes to here, the D. And the D, when we look here at the story, it is said, oh, this is the house of Mary that is in Loreto. Loreto is a place in Italy. And according to the tradition, the angels took the house of Mary and transported that to Italy. We are not in a historical explanation, but we are trying to understand the context of that time. And so that's a nice image for us, because you see that this house was displaced. It moved to another place. We go further, because after E, after D, we have the encounter between the angel Gabriel and Mary announcing that she will give birth to a son. But the story is not yet finished, because there we have God creating Adam. Because according to the tradition, and that is here mentioned, the announcement of the birth of Jesus was on the same date as the creation of Adam 3,000 or 4,000 years earlier. So mentally, we already went back in the time here, because that was happening before our scene. And now we go even further back in time. So we are mentally displaced in time and in place. It is not yet finished, because here we have these two scenes, namely Jesus dying on the cross and announcing then the entering into the limbo, announcing the liberation. According to the tradition, the Annunciation was the 25th of March, in a few years. That's 9 months before the 25th of December, when Jesus was born. And this is the same day as Jesus died on the cross. Sometimes it happens that Good Friday is exactly on that day. So this is the whole theology of that time. What is important for us is the method that is used here, namely that we have images that help us not to fix our regard on something stable, but that we are displaced in time and in place, so as to be free to meditate and to see what it means to us. Now, my question is the following. Here, you have the same here. And you see that, so this was the Annunciation, and then the next scene is the Visitation. Visitation means that Mary then is expecting a child and goes to visit Elizabeth. And so here you first have the repetition of the previous scene, which is the Annunciation. And then we see here the B, that is Joseph and Mary are traveling, and they will leave behind the donkey or the horse in front. And then we are explained again the building of where they will meet. That's the house of Zacharias in Judea. And then we have the encounter between Mary and Elizabeth. As you know, when they encounter, the child that Elizabeth is expecting bumps up in joy in her womb. And then we have the encounter between Zacharias and Joseph. As you can see, they carry their hat in their hands. So this is contemporary, but the scene continues a few weeks or a few months later when the child is born, and Mary helps in taking care of her, of Elizabeth and of the child. And after, you can see that here, and then they leave finally the scene and go back where later Jesus himself will be born. You see the same kind of displacements, and you have the same scene on the Chinese side. Now, my whole question is, we will look at the Chinese, the other Chinese version of this image, and from the first series, will we find the same kind of mental displacements in the Chinese version? You have it explicitly in the European version. Will we find the same kind in the Chinese version? That's my research question. And this presupposes the question, in Chinese tradition, are there examples of mental meditation, visual meditation, and so on? And there the answer is yes. For instance, in Buddhism, you have this famous Contemplation Sutra, in which the techniques are explained, how to meditate, how to contemplate, and visual contemplation of different scenes. As you can see, the construction of this image, you have your principal scene and then all kinds of smaller scenes on the side. It's interesting that you have similar things in, this is a painting of in Japan, in fact, where you can see the major scene and then the different scenes of the life of Mary. Here you have Annunciation, Visitation, and so on. So I come back on the image, the Buddhist image, and here you see this explains the contemplation of the setting sun, the contemplation of the water, the contemplation of the temple coupons. And so you can clearly see that this image helps the person to meditate and to say, now you meditate the sun, now you meditate the water, and so on. So there is a culture which is open to this kind of visual meditation. I give the images from Buddhism, but in fact, you also have in the Taoist tradition, you also have visual meditations. Okay. Now let us look at this image and see how this was transformed. You can see that here, the scene, the principal scene is apparently in the background. And then you have the two men meeting more in front, and you have a horse there. And here they are in a different order. Notice that here the two men are wearing the hat, because certainly at that time, wearing a hat was a sign of respect in China. The priests in the 17th century, when they were offering, like in the Taoist tradition, they are wearing a hat. And in Europe, that is impolite. Nice difference. But so my question is, here we have ABCD, and here we have no ABCD. But is there a kind of displacement or possible in this image? So first we look at the horse. We have a beautiful horse here and a beautiful horse there. And this horse was moved in front. When you look at this horse, you come at peace. Say, wait, I have to wait a moment. The horse has just arrived. We are waiting there. The construction of this image is very similar to different Chinese prints. We can look at the whole perspective. In fact, there are 3 perspectives in these images. The first is that we look from above in this image. Why from above? Because here we see the top of the tiles, but here also. And normally you would not be able to do so if you are standing here. And here you have exactly the same. Second is that you have a direction with the tiles that leads to the back with the opening in the back. Third, and that's typical of the Chinese drawing, that this scene here is a frontal scene. Here you can be just on the same level as the image, just as it is here also, that the image is usually divided in 2 parts where you can focus on the first part and you can focus on the second. Otherwise, they are standing here on top of the hat. That's not, that's the technique that is used typically in Chinese painting and in drawings. Here, similar, similar construction. You see a scene from that's from the Jinping Mei. All the images that I use is around the same time, with a horse and with a major scene. And important is also the tree that links the first and the back. You will see the tree in many of these images. Let me first look and focus on the gate, because here we have a gate added. We did not have it in the Western print. And the gate, you have very nice, what is the meaning and how do you have to draw a gate? This is from the Mustard Seed Garden Manual of Painting, and that's a bit later, with a beautiful explanation. It is not necessary to see the innermost rooms of dwellings in the mountains to know their peaceful seclusion. A glimpse of the gate is enough to recognize the abode of the follower of the Tao. So the gate tells us something about the abode of the follower of the Tao. And here you have different gates showing that. And we can look at the different uses of a gate. And these are the prints that I discovered yesterday, which is nice. They are peeping, they are having kind of glimpse of the inside. So a gate is also there to pause a moment and see, what is going on inside. And you see all over also the trees and the links and the gate and so on. Very classical theme on the whole. Another thing that is important in Chinese prints, just like in the Western prints, is that the images can be synchronic. That means 2 things happen at the same time. This theme happens at the same time as this here. Whereas in this case, there is a displacement because first they are here, and then they have entered, and then they are here. These are the same people, and that is often used to have 2 images basically in one. So let us look at these scenes. So here, what do we see? The horse. And what's the meaning of a horse? They have just arrived. And then there is a first encounter. And then they enter and they will through the back. In this case, they have arrived, they will enter, there will be an encounter, and they leave by the back. And here they have arrived, there is a first encounter, and then later on they will go to the center of the scene. Here, the Xi-Xiang-Qi, the same construction. They have arrived. There is a first encounter. There will be a second encounter. There will be a third encounter. And they leave through the back. You see how these images, by their construction, make us move mentally. We are dislocated, mentally dislocated. And now we can go back to our scene. And now it hardly deserves any explanation anymore. We have first the horse. And when you see the horse, you pause. And you think about what happened before the arrival of the horse. But when you meditate, you also think about what happened in the last few days. And then you have the gate. And you pause before the gate. And you look inside. And then you have the first encounter, which you can meditate again. And then you have the second encounter, which you can meditate again. And mentally, you can leave the scene from the back. So this is what I wanted to show, namely that the translation of these images in a new way, in fact, contain the same dynamism of dislocation that were possible in the original ones, in a new way and in a new version. So this is my conclusion. Many of these images created a space in which encounters could take place. And that is the idea of in-betweenness and also of displacement. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was a feast for our eyes.
Thank you.
We have 25 minutes, I've been told, and I've no doubt we'll have questions from our friends on the internet. I don't know how to use this stuff. Where do I see?
They will appear.
Where do I see the questions?
They will appear.
Oh, they will appear. Okay, so I don't have to worry about it. So people on the internet, if you have questions, by all means, you can write them in. But we also have people here in this hall, and I've no doubt you have many questions. And if you don't, I have mine, but I shall offer you the opportunity first. Well, there's a hand already, please. We can't hear you.
I'm reflecting about like when we're looking at the pictures, there's some like arrows happening between the translation of the pictures, like the details of the reading machine. And we see actually there are a lot of like unknowing kind of shown between the transmission of the pictures. And it also shows there is like a global awareness of trying to know each other, but also the unknowing part was showing as well. And so coming to the end, Professor, you kind of trying to make a conclusion that between the East and the West, we all show a displacement, a movement among those pictures, like the move of the story and the move of the plots and the development of the ideas. But also, I want to see whether there is also like arrows between like those movements. For example, in a picture that shows a religious story from the birth of Jesus, and then it goes to the death of the Jesus, all shown in one picture, there is a clear sequence of plots that's happening throughout the time. But will there also be like the misunderstanding that when China received those pictures, but the plots, the sequence of the plots was misplaced? Like they understand the story in a different way, in a different of like sequence of developments. I don't know whether my question was explained well.
Yeah, thank you very much. First, I appreciate your question and your stress on unknowing, because there are quite a number, certainly in these visual images, there are quite a number of things that we don't know and that are unknown. And you have seen also in the final part, there's also a kind of interaction between these images and myself in terms of interpretation. I cannot guarantee 100 or 100% that the interpretation that I gave is absolutely correct. That I do not even pretend that. But I hope to have transmitted that certainly also with images, there is also kind of, and then they come to this in-betweenness, there is always a kind of dialogue. So, and that's the strength of these images. These images still appeal to us, or at least to me. When I look and I discovered that, and that helped me to discover and looking at in a different way also at Chinese pictures and Chinese prints, that I felt that this was very enriching. Is my interpretation correct? I'm not sure. I don't know. And there we are on the theme of misunderstanding. Maybe there are misunderstandings in my interpretation, as there could have been or were in representations by Chinese drawers or engravers in the interpretation of Western images. But I'm less worried, maybe less worried with whether there is a misunderstanding or not. So when we judge and qualify something as a misunderstanding, then we say, okay, this is right and this is wrong. And that's certainly a correct way also to approach these themes. When we see this technology and so on, and then you can say, well, this is wrong, that cannot work. As simple as that. But I'm interested in what happens in the interaction between both that leads to new creations. And some of these creations don't work, but when we think deeper, then they still have a meaning. They wanted to represent something. And that's what I tried to grasp. What maybe do these images represent? Again, I'm not always sure that this is the right interpretation.
Let me say, if you want to ask a question in Chinese,
you can.
Cantonese or Putonghua, we can always translate the Cantonese for you if needed. by all means. So ask your questions English or Chinese. And the same applies to our friends on the screen. Please.
Thank you. One of the very memorable pictures I saw from your PowerPoint was the picture that included the different perspectives, the isometric perspective and the geometric perspective coexisting in one picture. And the way I interpret it was, it's like Chinese people using a Chinese perspective to interpret a Western painting. So a lot of it was using our own knowledge to interpret someone else's painting, their creation, which represents their perspective. And at the same time, retaining what we perceive, which is expressed by their artwork, so their perspective. So in that sense, do you think using our own perspective and retaining, do you think this kind of dialogue is drawing the two cultures closer, or do you think it is unable to do so, like using your own perspective to interpret someone else's representation? Yeah, something like that.
That's a value question. First, I think the perspective is a nice example of what happened with the study of these paintings in the last, let's say, 40, 50 years. The original question was the geometric perspective correctly transmitted to China? That was the major research method. And then the conclusion was usually, no, it was not correctly transmitted. So it was a misunderstanding, and that's it. Whereas, as I've tried to show, is let us look at these pictures and how they are combined, and not only where you had two perspectives in one drawing, a Chinese drawing, but you have the same in European books, where you can see that this French book adopted the isometric perspective. So I would less, let's say, make a value judgment. Does that bring people together or not? Is that the way how we have to proceed? But rather, I start from what do I see and what happened, and there I come on the fact of an encounter. Any of these images was the result of an encounter. And so there was, in one way or another, in most of these objects or paintings, there was a Chinese and there was a European who somehow worked together, talked together, and produced it. So they are the result of an encounter. Is that the best way to do it? I don't know. But if we look at the world today, how we are dressed, how we are, for instance, these are combinations of so-called, if you wear jeans, is that a good combination of a Western or whatever product? So I want to focus on this, how people encounter each other, and as a result of that, produce something that at least they find significant. And then our task is to take that serious, and a bit less, as whether then it is if the most effective way or not. Of course, I always want to nuance my statement by saying that if, of course, you want to transmit mathematics, there are not 15 ways to transmit mathematics. 1 + 1 is also 2, and so there is also sometimes an effectivity. But
May I add to that? I think an important question was asked. I can maybe change it just a little, make it a stronger criticism of what you have been saying, and see if we can solicit from you a firmer answer. If I turn that into a criticism, then what this lady is saying is, your talk brilliantly also illustrates the limitation of cross-cultural exchanges through the print media. Today it is paintings, drawings, but the other day it was printed words. Well, somehow, when these dead objects, after they've been produced, they don't change anymore. I see a sheet of paper with marks on it. I put my understanding on that. I may not be doing what was originally intended, and a lot of what is there I miss. So on the one hand, you have presented a case for the encounter. On the other hand, there's also the evidence there for the shortcomings of that sort of encounter. And what you just said now, and you didn't highlight on it, but you actually said it, and that is, this sort of encounter doesn't work unless the people are there. Unless somebody's standing there and telling you, this is not how I read perspective, you've got it wrong. Unless we've got this correction on the spot, the encounter does not work. And as historians, we know that well, because we talk about people who are dead and they're not there to correct us. So we make all kinds of mistakes. So would you accept, in fact, unless actually being there in the encounter, just doing it via print or drawings is not really all that effective?
I think it is an interaction between the prints and the human being. What I mean by that is that, well, one of the remarkable advantages of this encounter in the 17th century is that in China there is a well-established printing press culture. And they were able to produce these prints. And that's scripta manet. The prints remain, the people are gone. Now, what I find interesting is that, I'm not the only one talking about these prints. There are maybe 30, 40 articles written only on these prints, that they continue to produce a discourse about it. So what was originally an encounter, and which I think as historians we try to get a glimpse of, became an object, but this object also has a certain effect and continues to help or to encourage people to talk about it and to encounter with others about it, as we are doing here. Right. If we did not have these prints, we would not have this nice conversation. But, and there I come, what I find also interesting is that certainly these visual prints, even alone in my room, without anyone else, to a certain extent, I can have a kind of conversation with this print. And this is not only the projection of my ideas on these prints, but I would say also the prints on me. And so when I was yesterday in the library, I look at this and I say, yes, wow. So these prints also, it's like painting. So I sometimes consider also painting also as a subject. Of course, the painting cannot talk, but it's, and there, that's what I try to express by this in-betweenness. It's not the painting or the print and myself, but it's what happens in this interaction. And primarily, this is an interaction between people who talk and so on. but it can also be with objects.
You have made friends with it and learned its language.
Or I would say it in another way. The print or the image also gives me something. So that's why I call it a subject. Of course, it's not the same as a human being. but it's not. Otherwise, we are in the last 20, 30 years, everything becomes a projection of myself. And it's the whole question how to relate to authority. And I really think that it is not only projection of myself, but the other, including an image, can have an effect on me, even if the image does not speak or so.
Yeah. There was another hand there. Yes, please. Yeah. Yes, the speaker is coming.
To follow up this discussion, for the past 3 or 4 days, I have learned a lot from Professor Standaert. The day before yesterday during lunch, I remember I talked with Professor and we talked about the results and also the dynamic process. So I would like to turn to that part because I'm also fascinated by so many images you provided today. So I just have a very small question about it. So about the isometric and geometric images, I'm just wondering whether some Chinese painters who were in charge of this, because maybe they were trained by previous tradition in Chinese culture, and then they were commissioned by Western missionaries, and then could it be the reason why they combine these two traditions in one image like that? Or could you explain this kind of dynamic process and then it leads to this kind of results? Yes.
Well, in the case of Qiao Pingjun and also Nian Shi Yao, so they really learned, we know that, they learned the technique and they applied it. And apparently, not only apparently, with success. The print where you had a combination, there we don't know. But what I found interesting is that this engraver, on one hand, is capable of copying an original with a geometric perspective, and then added in the corner the tiles, and that he there made an isometric perspective. And again, that's what I find fascinating. You have to spend a lot of time to look at these images before you suddenly say, oh, but this is because these are just the tiles. So, and why did they do it? I don't know. But I find it fascinating. Yeah.
We have a few questions that came in online. I'll just read out the first one. We probably don't have time for all of them. But this gentleman says, there are two views on the translation of Western Catholic pictures and doctrines. One is that translation and new creation are beneficial. The other is that this localized adaptation is detrimental to Orthodox Catholicism. What do you think?
At least of all these images, I do not see that there is, if one wants to evaluate them in terms of Catholic Orthodox Catholic tradition, that there is one unorthodox one. So, no, let me formulate it maybe in another way. You have a whole variety of reactions towards these kind of adaptations, also by local cultures, local Christians. I give an example. It is not, let's say, an exception that today in Japan that a number of Christians would prefer the image of Mary from Renaissance or Baroque Italian painter rather than an image of Mary who became more Japanese. And this has to do with identities. Very often, a local community of Christians, they want to stress their identity different from the other traditions in a culture. For instance, Buddhist tradition or Taoist tradition or Shinto tradition and so on. So is one more orthodox than the other? Yeah, that's a theological question, and I don't think that this is less orthodox, because basically, yeah, we don't know how Mary looked like. And it's not only in terms of images, it's also the Gospels. What is interesting with the Gospels, they are written in Greek and not in the language that Jesus used. So the Gospels in themselves, they have a dynamic of translation. And so that's also with images. So does it mean that there can be unorthodox paintings? Probably yes. But I would not oppose the two views that are mentioned there, because I think that to a large extent, these are orthodox images, but they are certainly an adaptation to the local culture. Yeah.
We're running out of time, so I'm reserving the last question to myself. I'm sorry, we were a few more minutes, and I'm sitting here, so I'm taking it. I want to ask you this question. It's a big question. You've seen the cracks. You're creating more cracks, so more light is coming in. But eventually, what do? I mean, when you've seen the cracks and they go on and keep on cracking, where do you see this leading? What do you say to those of us who are interested in China as well as the West, and not only the West, but also Japan and Islam and so on? And we do want to bring cultures together. How should we conduct our research? What would you like to say to us?
You have a very difficult question. Final question. What I like very much is that very often in the interstices, new things are created. So yeah, let us keep on going, interacting as historians, yeah, trying to do serious research, getting into depths, and that should not necessarily be Christian themes. I've been working on comprehensive histories in China, the Gazette and things like that. And within these cracks, we discover openings that create, again, these new spaces of dialogue. Because, yeah, if we want more humanity, more openness towards different cultures, I think that I've showed that my idea is not a fusion of cultures, but is also not the complete separation of cultures, as if there is no dialogue possible. And that's why if we I come back on this image of the standstill in a dance, or the pause at the end of a beautiful music. And that's something that I really learned from Chinese culture. Let us also pay attention on these silent moments. That's why I did it. You see, right. Suddenly people say, what is he doing now? Because these are the moments in which things are created, and where we find the meaning, where we find when you spend some time with someone you know well, and you are able to spend silent moments with this person, something happens. And that's something that I received at least from Chinese culture. So that's my wish to especially all the young people in the room.
So with that, we conclude the year's Tianmu lectures. Thank you very much for joining, and join me in thanking Professor Standaert for the excellent lecture.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Standaert and Professor for this inspiring lecture, and thank you all again for coming. And lastly, please help us fill out the questionnaire by scanning the QR code on the screen. Thank you, and look forward to seeing you again in the future. 另外咧，喺長項中間都會有一份中央圖書館嘅問卷，咁希望各位參與者都可以幫手填寫一下。咁你熒幕上面呢個係我哋新亞書院嘅問卷嚟嘅。